The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling by Chiang.
When my daughter Nicole was an infant, I read an essay suggesting it might no longer be necessary to teach children how to read or write because speech recognition and synthesis would soon render those abilities superfluous. My wife and I were horrified by the idea, and we resolved that, no matter how sophisticated technology became, our daughter's skills would always rest on the bedrock of traditional literacy. It turned out that we and the essayist were both half correct. Now that she's an adult, Nicole can read as well as I can. But there is a sense in which she has lost the ability to write. She doesn't dictate her messages and ask virtual secretary to read back to her what she last said, the way an essayist predicted. Nicole sub-vocalizes. Her retinal projector displays the words in her field of vision, and she makes revisions using a combination of gestures and eye movements. For all practical purposes, she can write. But take away the assistive software and give her nothing but a keyboard like the one that I remain faithful to, and she'll have difficulty spelling out many of the words in this very sentence. Under those specific circumstances, English becomes a bit like a second language to her, one that she can speak fluently but can only barely write. It may sound like I'm disappointed in Nicole's intellectual achievements, but that's absolutely not the case. She's smart and dedicated to her job at an art museum when she could be earning more money elsewhere, and I've always been proud of her accomplishments. But there is still the past me, who would have been appalled to see his daughter lose her ability to spell, and I can't deny that I am continuous with him. It's been more than 20 years since I read that essay, and in that period our lives have undergone countless changes that I couldn't have predicted. The most catastrophic one was when Nicole's mother, Angela, declared that she deserved more interesting life than the one we were giving her, and spent the next decade crisscrossing the globe. But the changes leading to Nicole's current form of literacy were more ordinary and gradual, a succession of software gadgets that not only promised, but in fact delivered, utility and convenience, and I didn't object to any of them at the times of their introduction. So it hasn't been my habit to engage in doomsaying whenever a new product is announced. I've welcomed new technology as much as anyone, but when Whetstone released its new search tool, Remem, it raised concerns for me in a way none of its predecessors did. Millions of people, some my age, but most younger, have been keeping life logs for years, wearing personal cams that capture continuous video of their entire lives. People consult their life logs for a variety of reasons. Everything from reliving favorite moments to tracking down the cause of allergic reactions, but only intermittently. No one wants to spend all of their time formulating queries and sifting through the results. Life logs are the most complete photo album imaginable, but like most photo albums, they lie dormant except on special occasions. Now, Whetstone aims to change all of that. They claim Remem's algorithms can search an entire haystack by the time you finish saying needle. Remem monitors your conversations for references to past events, and then displays videos of that event in the lower left corner of your field of vision. If you say, "Remember dancing the conga at that wedding?" Remem will bring up the video. If the person you're talking to says, "The last time we were at the beach," Remem will bring up the video. And it's not only for us to use when speaking with someone else. Remem also monitors your subvocalizations. If you read the words, "the first Szechuan restaurant you ate at," your vocal cords will move as if you're reading aloud, and Remem will bring up the relevant video. There's no denying the usefulness of a software that can actually remember the question, "Where did I put my keys?" But Whetstone is positioning Remem as more than a handy virtual assistant. They want it to take the place of your natural memory. It was the summer of Jijingi's 13th year when a European came to live in the village. The dusty Harmattan winds had just begun blowing from the north when Sabe, the elder, who was regarded as the chief by all local families, made the announcement. Everyone's initial reaction was alarm, of course. "What have we done wrong?" Jijingi's father asked Sabe. Europeans had first come to Tivland many years ago, and while some elders said one day they'd leave and life would return to the ways of the past, until that day arrived, it was necessary for the Tiv to get along with them. This had meant many changes in the way the Tiv did things, but it had never meant Europeans living among them before. The usual reason for Europeans to come to the village was to collect taxes for the roads that they had built. They visited some clans more often because the people refused to pay taxes, but that hadn't happened in the chiang clan. Sabi and the other clan elders had agreed that paying taxes was the best strategy. Sabi told everyone not to worry. This European is a missionary. That means all he does is pray. He has no authority to punish us, but our making him welcome will please the men in his administration. He ordered 2 huts built for the missionary, a sleeping hut and a reception hut. Over the course of the next several days, everyone took time off from harvesting the guinea corn to help lay bricks, sink posts into the ground, weave grass into thatch for the roof. It was during this final step, pounding the floor, that the missionary arrived. His porters appeared first, the boxes they carried visible from a distance, as they threaded their way between the cassava fields. The missionary himself was the last to appear, apparently exhausted, although he carried nothing. His name was Mosby, and he thanked everyone who had worked on the huts. He tried to help, but it quickly became clear that he didn't know how to do anything, so eventually he just sat in the shade of a locust tree and wiped his head with a piece of cloth. Jijingi watched the missionary with curiosity. The man opened one of his boxes and took out what at first looked like a block of wood, but then he split it open and Jijingi realized it was a tightly bound sheaf of papers. Jijingi had seen paper before, when Europeans collected taxes. They gave paper in return so that the village had some proof of what they've paid. But the paper that the missionary was looking at was obviously a different sort and must have had some other purpose. The man noticed Jijingi was looking at him and invited him to come closer. "My name is Mosby," he said. "What's your name?" "I am Jijingi, and my father is Orga of the Shangjev clan." Mosby spread open the sheaf of paper and gestured toward it. "Have you heard of the story of Adam?" he asked. "Adam was the first man. We are all children of Adam." "Here, we are descendants of Shangjev," said Jijingi. "And everyone in Tivland is a descendant of Tiv." "Yes, but your ancestor Tiv was descended from Adam, just as my ancestors were. We're all brothers. Do you understand?" The missionary spoke as if his tongue were too large for his mouth, but Jijingi could tell what he was saying. "Yes, I understand." Mosby smiled and pointed out the paper. "This paper tells the story of Adam." "How can paper tell a story?" "It is an art that we Europeans know. When a man speaks, we make marks on this paper. When another man looks at the paper later, he sees the marks and knows the sound the first man made. In that way, the second man can hear what the first man said." Jijingi remembered something his father had told him about old Gegba, who was one of the most skilled in bushcraft. "Where you and I would see nothing but some disturbed grass, he can see that a leopard killed a crane rat at that spot and carried it off," his father said. Gegba was able to look at the ground and know what had happened even though he had not been present. This art of the Europeans must be similar. Those who were skilled in interpreting the marks could hear the story even though they hadn't been there when it was told. "Tell me the story that this paper tells," he said. Mosby told him about the story of Adam and his wife being tricked by a snake. Then he asked Jijingi, "How do you like it?" "You're a poor storyteller, but the story is interesting enough." Mosby laughed. "I'm not good at the Tiv language, but this is a good story, and it is the oldest story we have. It was first told long before your ancestor Tiv was born." Jijingi was dubious. "That paper can't be so old." "No, this paper is not, but the marks on it were copied from older paper, and those marks were copied from older paper, and so forth many times." That would be impressive, if true. Jijingi liked stories, and older stories were often best. "How many stories do you have there?" "Very many." Mosby flipped through the sheaf of papers, and Jijingi could see each shape was covered with marks from edge to edge. There must be many, many stories there. "This art you spoke of, interpreting marks on paper, is it only for Europeans?" "No, I can teach it to you. Would you like that?" Cautiously, Jijingi nodded. As a journalist, I have long appreciated the usefulness of life logging for determining facts of the matter. There is scarcely a legal proceeding, criminal or civil, that doesn't make use of someone's life log, and rightly so. When the public interest is involved, finding out how it actually happened is important. Justice is an essential part of the social contract, and you can't have justice until you know the truth. However, I've been much more skeptical about the use of life logging in purely personal situations. When life logging first became popular, there were couples who thought that they could use it to settle arguments over who had actually said what, using the video record to prove that they were right. But finding the right clip of the video often wasn't easy, and all but the most determined gave up in doing so. The inconvenience acted as a barrier, limiting the searching of life logs to those situations in which effort was warranted, namely situations in which justice was the motivating factor. Now with Remem, finding the exact moment has become easy, and life logs that previously lay all but ignored are now being scrutinized as if they were crime scenes, thickly strewn with evidence for use in domestic squabbles. I typically write for the news section, but I've written feature stories as well. And so, I've pitched an article about the potential downside of Remem to my managing editor. He gave me the go-ahead. My first interview was with a married couple, whom I'll call Joel and Deirdre, an architect and a painter, respectively. It wasn't hard to get them talking about Remem. Joel is always saying that he knew it all along, said Deirdre, even when he didn't. It used to drive me crazy, because I couldn't get him to admit that he used to believe something else. Now I can. For example, we were talking about the McKittridge kidnapping case. She sent me the video of one argument she had with Joel. My retinal projector displayed footage of a cocktail party. It's from Deirdre's point of view, and Joel is telling a number of people. It was pretty clear that he was guilty from the day he was arrested. Deirdre's voice. You didn't always think that. For months, you argued about how he was innocent. Joel shakes his head. No, you're misremembering. I said that even people who are obviously guilty deserve a fair trial. That's not what you said. You said he was being railroaded. You're thinking of someone else. That wasn't me. No, it was you. Look, a separate video windowed up. An excerpt of her life log that she had looked up and broadcasted to other peoples they'd been talking to. Within the nested video, Joel and Deirdre were sitting in a cafe, and Joel is saying, he's a scapegoat. The police needed to reassure the public, so they arrested a convenient suspect. Now he's done for. Deirdre replies, you don't think there's any chance of him being acquitted? And Joel answers, not unless he can afford a high-powered defense team, and I'll bet you he can't. People in his position will never get a fair trial. I closed both windows, and Deirdre said, without Remem, I'd never have been able to convince him that he had changed his position. Now I have proof. Fine, you were right that time, said Joel, but you didn't have to do all that in front of our friends. You correct me in front of our friends all the time, and you're telling me I can't do the same? Here was the line at which the pursuit of truth ceased to be an intrinsic good. When the only persons affected have a personal relationship with each other, other priorities are often more important. And a forensic pursuit of the truth could be harmful. Did it really matter whose idea it was to take the vacation that turned out so disastrously? Did you need to know which partner was more forgetful about completing errands the other person asked of them? I was no expert on marriage, but I knew what marriage counselors said. Pinpointing blame was never the answer. Instead, couples need to acknowledge each other's feelings and address their problems as a team. Next, I spoke with the spokesperson from Whetstone, Erica Myers. For a while, she gave me a typically corporate spiel about benefits of Remem. Making information more accessible is an intrinsic good, she says. Ubiquitous video has revolutionized law enforcement. Businesses become more efficient when they adopt good record-keeping practices. The same thing happens to us as individuals when our memories become more accurate. We get better, not just at doing our jobs, but at living our lives. When I asked her about couples like Joel and Deirdre, she said, if your marriage is solid, remem isn't going to hurt that. But if you're the type of person who's constantly trying to prove that you're right and your spouse is wrong, then your marriage is going to be in trouble whether you use remem or not. I conceded that she may have a point in this particular case, but I asked her, didn't she think remem created greater opportunities for those types of arguments to arise, even in solid marriages, by making it easier for people to keep score? Not at all, she said. Remem didn't give them scorekeeping mentality. They developed that on their own. Another couple could just as easily use remem to realize that they've both misremembered things and become more forgiving when that sort of mistake happens. I predict the latter scenario will be more than common one for our customers as a whole. I wished I could share Erica Meyer's optimism, but I knew that new technology didn't always bring out the best in people. Who hasn't wished they could prove their version of events was the correct one? I could easily see myself using remem the way Deirdre did, and I wasn't at all certain that doing so would be good for me. Anyone who has wasted hours surfing the net knows that technology can encourage bad habits. Mosby gave a sermon every 7 days on the day devoted to resting and brewing and drinking beer. He seemed to disapprove of the beer drinking, but he didn't want to speak on one of the days of work, so the day of beer brewing was the only one left. He talked about the European God and told people that following his rules would improve their lives, but his explanations of how that would do so weren't particularly persuasive. But Mosby also had skill in dispensing medicine, and he was willing to learn on how to work the fields. So gradually, people grew more accepting of him, and Jijingi's father let him visit Mosby occasionally to learn the art of writing. Mosby offered to teach the other children as well, and for a time, Jijingi's age mates came along, mostly to prove to each other that they weren't afraid of being near a European. Before long, the other boys grew bored and left, but because Jijingi remained interested in writing and his father thought it would help keep the Europeans happy, he was eventually permitted to go every day. Mosby explained to Jijingi how each sound a person spoke could be indicated with different marks on the paper. The marks were arranged in rows like plants in a field. You looked at the marks as if you were walking down a row and made the sound each mark indicated, and you would find yourself speaking what the original person had said. Mosby showed him how to make each of the different marks on a sheet of paper using a tiny wooden rod that had a core of soot. In a typical lesson, Mosby would speak and then write what he had said. When night comes, I shall sleep. Tugba ile yomi yav. There are two persons. Urav bambar uhar. Jijingi carefully copied the writing on his sheet of paper, and when he was done, Mosby would look at it. Very good, but you need to leave spaces when you write. I have, Jijingi pointed at the gap between each row. No, that is not what I mean. Do you see the spaces within each line? He pointed to his own paper. Jijingi understood. Your marks are clumped together, while mine are arranged evenly. These are not just clumps of marks. They are, I do not know what you call them. He picked up his thin sheaf of paper from the table and flipped through it. I do not see it here. Where I come from, we call them words. When we write, we leave spaces between the words. But what are words? How can I explain it? He thought a moment. If you would speak slowly, you pause very briefly after each word. That's why we leave the spaces in those places when we write, like this. How many years old are you? He wrote on his paper as he spoke, leaving a space each time he paused. I am a u, kuma, a, me. But you speak slowly because you are a foreigner. I'm Tiv, so I don't pause when I speak. Shouldn't my writing be the same? It does not matter how fast you speak. Words are the same, whether you speak them quickly or slowly. Then, why did you say a pause after each word? That is the easiest way to find them. When saying this very slowly, he pointed at what he had just written. Chijingi spoke very slowly, the way the man might when he was trying to hide his drunkenness. Why is there no space in between am and yom? Ayom is one word. You do not pause in the middle of it. But I wouldn't pause after ayom either, Mosby sighed. I will think more about how to explain what I mean. For now, just leave spaces in the places where I leave spaces. What a strange art writing was. When sowing a field, it was best to have the seed yams spaced evenly. Chijingi's father would have beaten him if he clumped the yams the way Mosby clumps his marks on paper. But he had resolved to learn this art as best as he could. And if that meant clumping the marks, he would do so. It was only many lessons later that Chijingi finally understood where he should leave spaces and what Mosby meant when he said word. You could not find the places where the words began and ended by listening. The sounds a person made while speaking were as smooth and unbroken as the hide of a goat's leg, but the words were like the bones underneath the meat, and the space between them was the joint where you'd cut if you wanted to separate it into pieces. By leaving spaces when he wrote, Mosby was making visible the bones in what he said. Chijingi realized that, if he thought hard about it, he was now able to identify the words when people spoke in ordinary conversation. The sounds that came from a person's mouth hadn't changed, but he understood them differently. He was aware of the pieces from which the whole was made. He himself had been speaking in words all along. He just hadn't known it until now. The ease of searching that Remem provides is impressive enough, but that merely scratches the surface of what Whetstone sees as its product's potential. When Deirdre fact-checked her husband's previous statements, she was posing explicit queries to Remem, but Whetstone expects that, as people become accustomed to their product, queries will remain the place of ordinary acts of recall, and Remem will be integrated into their very thought processes. Once that happens, we will become cognitive cyborgs, effectively incapable of misremembering anything. Digital video stored on error-corrected silicon will take over the role once filled by our fallible temporal lobes. What might it be like to have a perfect memory? Arguably, the individual with the best memory ever documented was Solomon Zherevshevsky, who lived in Russia during the first half of the 20th century. The psychologists who tested him found that he could hear a series of words or numbers once and remember it for months or even years later. With no knowledge of Italian, Zherevshevsky was able to quote stanzas of the Divine Comedy that had been read to him 15 years earlier. But having a perfect memory wasn't the blessing one might imagine it to be. Reading a passage of text evoked so many images of Zherevshevsky's mind that he often couldn't focus on what it actually said, and his awareness of innumerable specific examples made it difficult for him to understand abstract concepts. At times, he tried to deliberately forget things. He wrote down numbers he had no longer wanted to remember on slips of paper and then burnt them, a kind of slash and burn approach to clearing out the undergrowth of his mind, but to no avail. When I raised the possibility that a perfect memory might be a handicap to Whetstone's spokesperson, Erica Myers, she had a ready reply. This is no different from the concepts people used to have about retinal projectors, she said. They worried that seeing updates constantly would be a distracting or overwhelming. But we've all accepted them. I didn't mention that not everyone considered that a positive development. And ReMem is entirely customizable, she continued. If at any time you find it's doing too many searches for your needs, you can decrease its level of responsiveness. But according to our customer analytics, our users haven't been doing that. As they become more comfortable with it, they're finding that ReMem becomes more helpful and more responsive. But even if ReMem wasn't constantly crowding your field of vision with unwanted imagery of the past, I wondered if there wasn't issues raised simply by having that imagery be perfect. Forgive and forget, goes the expression, and for our idealized, magnanimous selves, that was all you needed. But for our actual selves, the relationship between those two actions wasn't so straightforward. In most cases, we had to forget a little bit before we could forgive. When we no longer experienced the pain as fresh, the insult was easier to forgive, which in turn made it less memorable, and so on. It was this psychological feedback loop that made initially frustrating offenses seem pardonable in the mirror of hindsight. What I feared was that ReMem would make it impossible for this feedback loop to get rolling. By fixing every detail of an insult in indelible video, it could prevent the softening that's needed for forgiveness to begin. I thought back to what Erica Myers said about ReMem's inability to hurt solid marriages. Implicit in that assertion was the claim about what qualified as a solid marriage. If someone's marriage was built on, as ironic as it might sound, a cornerstone of forgetfulness, what right did Whetstone have to shatter that? The issue wasn't confined to marriages. All sorts of relationships rely on forgiving and forgetting. My daughter Nicole has always been strong-willed, rambunctious when she was a child, openly defiant as an adolescent. She and I had many furious arguments during her teen years, arguments that we would mostly have put behind us, and now our relationship was pretty good. What if we'd had ReMem? Would we still be speaking to each other? I don't mean to say that forgetting is the only way to mend relationships. While I can no longer recall most of the arguments Nicole and I had, I am grateful that I can't. One of the arguments I remember clearly is one that spurred me to be a better father. It was when Nicole was 16, a junior in high school. It had been 2 years since her mother, Angela, had left. Probably one of the 2 hardest years of both our lives. I don't remember what started the argument, something trivial, no doubt, but it escalated, and before long, Nicole was taking her anger at Angelica out on me. You're the reason she left. You drove her away. You can leave too, for all I care. I sure as hell would be better off without you. And to demonstrate her point, she stormed out of the house. I knew it wasn't premeditated malice on her part. I don't think she engaged in much premeditation in anything during that phase in her life. But she couldn't have come up with a more hurtful accusation if she'd tried. I've been devastated by Angela's departure, and I constantly was wondering what I could have done differently to keep her. Nicole didn't come back until the next day, and that night was one of soul-searching for me. While I didn't believe I was responsible for her mother leaving us, Nicole's accusations still served as a wake-up call. I hadn't been conscious of it, but I realized that I had been thinking of myself as the greatest victim of Angela's departure, wallowing in self-pity over just how unreasonable my situation was. It hadn't been my idea to have children. It was Angela's who wanted to be a parent, and now she had left me holding the bag. What sane world would leave me with a sole responsibility for raising an adolescent girl? How could a job that was so difficult be entrusted to someone with no experience whatsoever? Nicole's accusation made me realize her predicament was worse than mine. At least I had volunteered for this duty, albeit long ago and without full appreciation for what I was getting into. Nicole had been drafted into her role with no say whatsoever. If there was anyone who had a right to be resentful, it was her. And while I thought I'd be doing a good job of being a father, obviously I needed to be doing better. I turned myself around. Our relationship didn't improve overnight, but over the years, I was able to work myself back into Nicole's good graces. I remember the way she hugged me at her college graduation, and I realized many years of effort had paid off. Would those years of repair have been possible with Remem? Even if each of us could have refrained from throwing the other's bad behavior into their faces, the opportunity to privately rewatch video of our arguments seems like it could be pernicious. Vivid reminders of how she and I yelled at each other in the past might have kept our anger fresh and prevented us from rebuilding our relationship. Djingi wanted to write down some of the stories of where the Tiv people came from, but the storytellers spoke rapidly, and he wasn't able to write fast enough to keep up with them. Mosby said he would get better with practice, but Djingi despaired that he'd ever become fast enough. Then, one summer, a European woman named Reese came to visit the village. Mosby said she was a person who learns about other people, but could not explain what that meant, only that she wanted to learn about Tivland. She asked questions of everyone, not just the elders, but young men too, even women and children, and she wrote down everything they had told her. She didn't try to get anyone to adopt European practices, where Mosby had insisted that there was no such thing as curses and that everything was God's will. Reese asked about how curses worked and listened attentively to explanations of how your kin on your father's side could curse you, while your kin on your mother's side could protect you from curses. One evening, Kokwa, the best storyteller in the village, told a story of how the Tiv people split into different lineages, and Reese had written it down exactly as he told it. Later, she had recopied the story using a machine she poked at noisily with her fingers, so that she had a copy that was clean and easy to read. When Djingi asked if she could make another copy for him, she agreed, much to his excitement. The paper version of the story was curiously disappointing. Djingi remembered that when he had first learned about writing, he imagined it would enable him to see storytelling performed as vividly as he were there. But writing didn't do that. When Kokwa told a story, he didn't merely use words. He used the sound of his voice, the movement of his hands, the light in his eyes. He told you the story with his whole body, and you understood it the same way. None of that was captured on paper. Only the bare words could be written down. And reading just the words gave you only a hint of the experience of listening to Kokwa himself, as if one were licking the pot in which okra had been cooked instead of eating the okra itself. Jijingi was still glad to have the paper version and would read it from time to time. It was a good story, worthy of being recorded on paper. Not everything written on paper was so worthy. During his sermons, Mosby would read aloud stories from his book, and they were often good stories, but he also read aloud words he had written down just a few days before, and those words were often not stories at all, merely claims that learning more about European God would improve the lives of the Tiv people. One day, when Mosby has been eloquent, Jijingi complimented him. I know you think highly of all your sermons, but today's sermon was a good one. Thank you, said Mosby, smiling. After a moment, he asked, why do you say I think highly of all my sermons? Because you expect people will read them many years from now. I don't expect that. What makes you think that? You write them all down before you even deliver them. Before even one person has heard a sermon, you have written it down for the future generations. Mosby laughed. No, that isn't why I write them down. Why then? He knew it wasn't for people far away to read them, because sometimes messages came to the village to deliver paper to Mosby, and he never sent his sermons back with them. I write down the words so I do not forget what I want to say when I give my sermon. How could you forget what you want to say? You and I are speaking right now, and neither of us has the need of paper to do so. A sermon is different from conversation, Mosby paused to consider. I want to be sure I give my sermons as well as possible. I won't forget what I want to say, but I might forget the best way to say it. If I write it down, I don't have to worry. But writing the words down does more than help me remember. It helps me think. How does writing help you think? That is a good question, he said. It is strange, isn't it? I do not know how to explain it, but writing helps me decide what I want to say, where I come from. There's a very old proverb, verba volant, scripta manant. In Tiv, you would say, spoken words fly away, written words remain. Does that make sense? Yes, Jijingi said, just to be polite. It made no sense at all. The missionary wasn't old enough to be senile, but his memory must have been terrible, and he didn't want to admit it. Jijingi told his aide mates about this, and they joked amongst themselves for days. Whenever they exchanged gossip, they would add, will you remember that? This will help you, and mimic Mosby writing at the table. On an evening the following year, Kokwa announced he would tell the story of how the Tiv split into different lineages. Jijingi brought out a paper version he had, so he could remember the story the same time Kokwa told it. Sometimes he could follow along, but it was often confusing because Kokwa's words didn't match what was written on the paper. After Kokwa finished, Jijingi said to him, you didn't tell the story the same way you told it last year. Nonsense, said Kokwa. When I tell a story, it doesn't change, no matter how much time passes. Ask me to tell it 20 years from today, and I will tell it exactly the same. Jijingi pointed at the paper he held. This paper is the story you told last year, and there were many differences. He picked up one he remembered. Last time you said, the Uyengi captured the women and children and carried them off as slaves. This time you said, they made slaves of the women, but they did not stop there. They even made slaves of the children. That is the same. It is the same story, but you have changed the way you tell it. No, said Kokwa. I told it just as I did before. Jinjingi didn't want to try to explain what words were. Instead, he said, if you told it as you did before, you would say, the Yuyengi captured the women and children and carried them off as slaves every time. For a moment, Kokwa stared at him, and then he laughed. Is this what you think is important, now that you have learned the art of writing? Sabe, who had been listening to them, chided Kokwa. It is not your place to judge Jinjingi. The hare favors one food, the hippo favors another. Let each spend his time as he pleases. Of course, Sabe, of course. Kokwa threw himself a derisive glance at Jinjingi. Afterwards, Jinjingi remembered the proverb Mosby had mentioned. Even though Kokwa was telling the same story, he might arrange the words differently each time he told it. He was skilled enough as a storyteller, so the arrangement of words didn't matter. It was different for Mosby, who never acted anything out when he gave his sermons. For him, the words were what was important. Jinjingi realized that Mosby wrote down the sermons not because his memory was terrible, but because he was looking for a specific arrangement of words. Once he found the one he wanted, he could hold on to it for as long as he needed. Out of curiosity, Jinjingi tried imagining he had to deliver a sermon and began writing down what he would say. Seated on the root of a mango tree with a notebook Mosby had given him, he composed a sermon to the Sav, the quality that enabled some men to have power over others, and a subject which Mosby hadn't understood and had dismissed as foolishness. He read his first attempt to one of his age mates, who pronounced it terrible, leading them to have a brief shoving match. But afterwards, Jinjingi had admitted his age mate was right. He tried writing out his sermon a second time, and then a third time, before he became tired of it and moved on to other topics. As he practiced his writing, Jinjingi came to understand what Mosby had meant. Writing was not just a way to record what someone said. It could help you decide what you would say before you said it. And words were not just pieces of speaking. They were pieces of thinking. When you wrote them down, you could grasp your thoughts like bricks in your hand and push them into different arrangements. Writing let you look at your thoughts in a way you couldn't if you were just talking. And having seen them, you could improve them, make them stronger and more elaborate. Psychologists make a distinction between semantic memory, knowledge of general facts, and episodic memory, recollection of personal experiences. We've been using technological supplements for semantic memory ever since the invention of writing. First books, then search engines. By contrast, we've historically resisted such aids when it comes to episodic memory. Few people have ever kept as many diaries or photo albums as they did ordinary books. The obvious reason is convenience. If we wanted a book on the birds of North America, we could consult one that an ornithologist had written. But if we wanted a daily diary, we had to write it for ourselves. But I also wonder if another reason is that subconsciously we regard our episodic memories as such an integral part of our identities that we were reluctant to externalize them, to relegate them to books on a shelf or files on a computer. That may be about to change. For years, parents have been recording their children's every moment. Even if children weren't wearing personal cams, their life logs were effectively already being compiled. Now parents are having their children wear retinal projectors at younger and younger ages so they can reap the benefits of assistive software agents sooner. Imagine what will happen if children begin using remem to access their life logs. Their mode of cognition will diverge from ours because the act of recall will be different. Rather than thinking of an event from her past and seeing it in her mind's eye, a child will subvocalize a reference to it and watch video footage with her physical eyes. Episodic memory will become entirely technologically mediated. An obvious drawback to such reliance is the possibility that people might become virtual amnesiacs whenever the software crashes. But just as worrying to me as the prospect of technological failure was that of technological success. How will it change a person's concept of herself when she's only seen her past through the unblinking eye of a video camera? Just as there's a feedback loop in softening harsh memories, there's also one at work in the romanticization of childhood memories, and disrupting that process will have consequences. The earliest birthday I can remember is my 4th. I remember blowing out the candles on my cake, the thrill of tearing the wrapping paper off presents. There's no video of the event, but there are snapshots in the family album, and they are consistent with what I remember. In fact, I suspect I no longer remembered the day itself. It's more likely that I manufactured the memory when I was first shown the snapshots, and over time, I've imbued it with the emotion I imagine I felt that day. Little by little, over repeated instances of recall, I've created a happy memory for myself. Another of my earliest memories is of playing on the living room rug, pushing toy cars around while my grandmother worked at her sewing machine. She would occasionally turn and smile warmly at me. There are no photos of that moment, so I know the recollection is mine and mine alone. It is a lovely, idyllic memory. Would I want to be presented with the actual footage of that afternoon? No, absolutely not. Regarding the role of truth in autobiography, the critic Paul Pascal wrote, "On one side are the truths of fact. On the other are the truth of the writer's feeling, and where the two coincide cannot be decided by any outside authority in advance. Our memories are private autobiographies, and that afternoon with my grandmother features prominently in mine because of the feelings associated with it. What if video footage revealed that my grandmother's smile was, in fact, perfunctory, that she was actually frustrated because her sewing wasn't going well? What's important to me about that memory is the happiness I associated with it, and I wouldn't want to jeopardize that. It seemed to me that continuous video of my entire childhood would be full of facts but devoid of feeling, simply because cameras couldn't capture the emotional dimensions of events. As far as the camera was concerned, that afternoon with my grandmother would be indistinguishable from 100 others. And if I'd grown up with access to all the video footage, there'd have been no way for me to assign more emotional weight to any particular day. No nucleus around which nostalgia could accrete. And what will the consequences be when people can claim to remember their infancy? I could readily imagine a situation where, if you ask a young person what their earliest memory is, she will simply look baffled. After all, She has video dating back to the day of her birth. The inability to remember her first few years of one's life, what psychologists call childhood amnesia, might soon be a thing of the past. No more would parents tell their children anecdotes beginning with the words, "You don't remember this because you were a toddler when it happened." It'll be as if childhood amnesia is a characteristic of humanity's childhood, and in aerobic fashion, our youth will vanish from our memories. Part of me wanted to stop this to protect children's ability to see the beginning of their lives filtered through gauze, to keep those origin stories from being replaced by cold, desaturated video. But maybe they will feel just as warmly about their lossless digital memories as I do of my imperfect organic memories. People are made of stories. Our memories are not impartial accumulation of every second we've lived. They're the narrative that we've assembled out of selected moments, which is why even when we've experienced the same events as other individuals, we never constructed identical narratives. The criteria used for selecting moments were different for each of us and a reflection of our personalities. Each of us noticed the detail that caught our attention and remembered what was important to us. And the narratives we built shaped our personalities in turn. But I wondered, if everyone remembered everything, would our differences get shaved away? What would happen to our sense of selves? It seemed to me that a perfect memory couldn't be a narrative any more than unedited security cam footage could be a feature film. When Jijinge was 20, an officer from the administration came to the village to speak to Sabe. He had brought with him a young Tiv man who had attended the mission school in Katsina Ala. The administration wanted to have a written record of all the disputes brought before the tribe courts, so they were assigning each chief one of these youths to act as a scribe. Sabe had Jijinge come forward, and to the officer he said, "I know you don't have enough scribes for all of Tivland. Jijinge here has learned to write. He can act as our scribe, and you can send your boy to another village." The officer tested Jijinge's ability to write, but Mosby had taught him well, and eventually the officer agreed to have him be Sabe's scribe. After the officer left, Jijinge asked Sabe why he hadn't wanted the boy from Katsina Ala to be his scribe. "No one who comes from the mission school can be trusted," said Sabe. "Why not? Did the Europeans make them liars?" "They're partly to blame, but so are we. When the Europeans collected boys from our mission school years ago, most elders gave them the ones that they wanted to get rid of, the layabouts and malcontents. Now, those boys have returned, and they feel no kinship to anyone. They wield their knowledge of writing like a long gun. They demand their chiefs find them wives, or else they'll write lies about them and have the Europeans depose them." Jijinge knew a boy who was always complaining and looking for ways to avoid work. It would be a disaster if someone like him had power over Sabe. "Can't you tell the Europeans about this?" "Many have," Sabe answered. "It was Maisho of the Kwande clan who warned me about the scribes. They were installed in Kwande villages first. Maisho was fortunate that the Europeans believed him instead of his scribes' lies, but he knows of other chiefs who are not so lucky. The Europeans often believe paper over people. I don't wish to take the chance." He looked at Jijinge seriously. "You are my kin, Jijinge, and kin to everyone in this village. I trust you to write down what I say." "Yes, Sabe." Tribal court was held every month, from morning until late afternoon, for 3 days in a row, and it always attracted an audience, sometimes one so large that Sabe had to demand everyone sit to allow the breeze to reach the center of the circle. Chijinge sat next to Sabe and recorded the details of each dispute in a book the officer had left. It was a good job. He was paid out of the fees collected from the disputants, and he was given not just a chair, but a small table too, which he could use for writing, even when the court wasn't in session. The complaints Sabe heard varied. One might be about a stolen bicycle. Another might be about whether a man was responsible for his neighbor's crops failing, but most had to do with wives. For one such dispute, Chijinge wrote down the following. Umem's wife, Girgi, has run away from home and gone back to her kin. Her kinsman, Anongo, has tried to convince her to stay with her husband, but Girgi refuses, and there is no more Anongo can do. Umem demands the return of the 11 pounds he paid as bride wealth. Anongo says he has no money at the moment, and moreover, that he was only paid 6 pounds. Sabe requested witness for both sides. Anongo says he has witnesses, but they have gone on a trip. Umem produces a witness who is sworn in. He testifies that he himself counted the 11 pounds that Umem paid to Anongo. Sabe asked Girgi to return to her husband and to be a good wife, but she says she has had all that she can stand of him. Sabe instructs Anongo to repay Umem 11 pounds, the first payment to be made in 3 months when his crops are saleable. Anongo agrees. It was the final dispute of the day, by which time Sabe was clearly tired. Selling vegetables to pay back bride wealth, he said afterwards, shaking his head. This wouldn't have happened when I was a boy. Chijinge knew what he meant. In the past, the elders said, you conducted exchanges with similar items. If you wanted a goat, you could trade chickens for it. If you wanted to marry a woman, you promised one of your kinswomen to her family. Then the Europeans said they would no longer accept vegetables as payment for taxes, insisting that it be paid in coin. Before long, everything could be exchanged for money. You could use it to buy everything from calabash to a wife. The elders considered it absurd. The old ways are vanishing, agreed Chijinge. He didn't say that young people preferred things this way, because the Europeans had also decreed that bride wealth could only be paid if the woman consented to the marriage. In the past, a young woman might be promised to an old man with leprous hands and rotting teeth, and have no choice but to marry him. Now, a woman could marry the man she favored, as long as he could afford to pay the bride wealth. Chijinge himself was saving money to marry. Mosby came to watch sometimes, but he found the proceedings confusing and often asked Chijinge questions afterwards. For example, there was a dispute between Umem and Anongo over how much bride wealth was owed. Why was only one witness sworn in? Asked Mosby, to ensure he had said precisely what happened. But if Umem and Anongo were sworn in, that would have ensured that they said precisely what happened too. Anongo was able to lie because he was not sworn in. Anongo didn't lie, said Chijinge. He said what he considered right, just as Umem did. But what Anongo said wasn't the same as what the witness said. But that doesn't mean he was lying. Then Chijinge remembered something about the European language and understood Mosby's confusion. Our language has two words for what your language called true. There is what's right, mimi, and what's precise, vo. In a dispute, the principals say what they consider right. They speak mimi. The witnesses, however, are sworn in to say precisely what happened. They speak vo. When Sabe has heard what happened, he can decide what action is mimi for everyone. But it's not lying if the principals don't speak vo, as long as they can speak mimi. Mosby clearly disapproved. In the land I come from, everyone who testifies in court must swear to speak vo, even the principals. Jijinge didn't see the point in that, but all he said was, every tribe has its own customs. Yes, customs vary, but the truth is the truth. It doesn't change from one person to another. And remember what the Bible says, the truth shall set you free. I remember, said Jijinge. Mosby had said that it was knowing God's truth that had made the Europeans so successful. There was no denying their wealth and power. But who knew what was the cause? In order to write about Remem, it was only fair that I try it out myself. The problem was that I didn't have a life log for it to index. Typically, I only activated my personal cam when I was conducting an interview or covering an event. But I've certainly spent time in the presence of people who'd kept life logs, and I could make use of what they'd recorded. While all life logging software has privacy controls in place, most people also grant basic sharing rights. If your actions were recorded in their life log, you have access to the footage when you're present. So I launched an agent to assemble the partial life log from the footage others had recorded, using my GPS history as the basis for the query. Over the course of a week, my request propagated through social networks and public video archives, and I was rewarded with snippets of video ranging from a few seconds in length to a few hours. Not just security cam footage, but excerpts from the life logs of friends, acquaintances, and even complete strangers. The resulting life log was, of course, highly fragmentary compared to what I would have if I had been recording video myself. And the footage was all from third-person perspective, rather than first-person perspective that most life logs have. But Remem was able to work with that. I expected that coverage would be thickest in the later years, simply due to the increasing popularity of life logs. It was somewhat to my surprise then that when I looked at the graph of coverage, I found a bump in the coverage over a decade ago. Nicole had been keeping a life log since she was a teenager, so an unexpectedly large segment of my domestic life was present. I was initially a bit uncertain of how to test Remem, since I obviously couldn't ask to bring up video of an event I didn't remember. I figured I'd start with something I did remember. I subvocalized the time Vince told me about the trip to Palau. My retinal projector displayed a window in the lower left corner of my field of vision. I'm having lunch with my friends Vincent and Jeremy. Vincent didn't maintain a life log either, so the footage was from Jeremy's point of view. I listened to Vince rave about scuba diving for a minute. Next, I tried something I only vaguely remembered. The dinner banquet that I saw Deborah and Lyle. I didn't remember who else was sitting at the table and wondered if Remem could help me identify them. Sure enough, Deborah had recorded that evening, and with her video, I was able to use Recognition Agent to identify everyone sitting across from us. After those initial successes, I had a run of failures. Not surprising considered the gaps in the lifelong. But over the course of an hour-long trip survey of past events, Remen's performance was generally impressive. Finally, it seemed time for me to try Remem on some memories that were more emotionally frayed. My relationship with Nicole felt strong enough now for me to safely revisit the fights we'd had when she was young. I figured I'd start with the argument I remembered clearly and work backwards from there. I subvocalized the time Nicole yelled at me, "You're the reason she left." The window displayed the kitchen of the house we lived in when Nicole was growing up. The footage is from Nicole's point of view, and I am standing in front of the stove. It's obvious we're fighting. "You're the reason she left. You can leave too, for all I care. I sure as hell would be better off without you." The words were just as I remembered them, but it wasn't Nicole saying them. It was me. My first thought was that it must be a fake, that Nicole had edited the video to put her words into my mouth. She must have noticed my request for access to her life log footage and concocted this to teach me a lesson. Or perhaps it was a film that she had created to show her friends to reinforce the stories she had told about me. But why was she still so angry at me that she would do such a thing? Hadn't we gotten past this? I started skimming through the video, looking for inconsistencies that would indicate where the edited footage had been spliced in. The subsequent footage showed Nicole running out of the house, just as I had remembered, so there wouldn't be any signs of inconsistency there. I rewound the video and started watching the preceding argument. Initially, I was angry as I watched, angry at Nicole for going through such lengths to cause this lie, because the preceding footage was all consistent with me being the one who yelled at her. Then, some of what I was saying in the video began to sound queasily familiar, complaining about being called to her school again because she had gotten into trouble, accusing her of spending time with the wrong crowd. But this wasn't the context I had said those things, was it? I had been voicing my concerns, not berating her. Nicole must have had adapted things she'd said elsewhere to make her slanderous video possible. That was the only explanation, right? I asked Remem to examine the video's watermark and reported the video was unmodified. I saw that Remem had suggested a correction in my search terms. Where I had said the time Nicole yelled at me, it offered the time I yelled at Nicole. The correction must have displayed at the same time of the initial result, but I hadn't noticed. I shut down Remem in disgust, furious with the product. I was about to search for information on forging a digital watermark to prove this video had been faked, but I stopped myself, recognizing it was an act of desperation. I would have testified, hand on the stack of the Bibles, or using any oath required of me, that it was Nicole who accused me of being the reason her mother left. My recollection of that argument was as clear as any memory I had, but that wasn't the only reason I'd found the video hard to believe. It was also my knowledge that, whatever my faults or imperfections, I was never the kind of father who would say such a thing to his child. Yet here was the digital video proving that I had been exactly that kind of father. And while I wasn't that man anymore, I couldn't deny that I was continuous with him. Even more telling was the fact that for many years I had successfully hidden the truth from myself. Earlier, I said that the details we choose to remember are a reflection of our personalities. What did that say about me that I put those words in Nicole's mouth instead of mine? I remembered that argument as being a turning point for me. I had imagined a narrative of redemption and self-improvement in which I was the heroic single father rising to meet the challenge. But the reality was, what? How much of what happened since then could I take credit for? I restarted Remem and began looking at the video of Nicole's graduation from college. That was an event I had recorded myself, so I had footage of Nicole's face, and she seemed genuinely happy in my presence. Was she hiding her true feelings so well that I couldn't detect them? or if our relationship had actually improved. How had that happened? I had obviously been a much worse father 14 years ago than I'd thought. It would have been tempting to conclude I had come farther to reach where I currently was, but I couldn't trust my perceptions anymore. Did Nicole even have positive feelings about me now? I wasn't going to try using Remem to answer this question. I needed to go to the source. I called Nicole and left a message saying I wanted to talk to her and asking if I could come over to her apartment that evening. It was a few years later that Sabe began attending a series of meetings of all of the chiefs of the Shengev clan. He explained to Jijingi that the Europeans no longer wished to deal with so many chiefs and were demanding that all of the Tiv land be divided into 8 groups they called septs. As a result, Sabe and the other chiefs had to discuss who the Shengev clan would join with. Although there was no need for a scribe, Jijingi was curious to hear the deliberations and asked Sabe if he might accompany him, and Sabe agreed. Jijingi had never seen so many elders in one place before. Some were even-tempered and dignified like Sabe, while others were loud and full of bluster. They argued for hours on end. In the evening after Jijingi had returned, Mosby asked him what it had been like. Jijingi sighed. Even if they're not yelling, they're fighting like wildcats. Who does Sabe think you should join? We should join with the clans that we're most closely related to. That's the Tiv way. And since Shengev was the son of Kwande, our clans should join with the Kwande clan, who live in the south. That makes sense, said Mosby. So why is there disagreement? Members of the Shengev clan don't all live next to each other. Some live on the farmland in the west, Jakira clan, and the elders there are friendly with the Jakira elders. They'd like the Shengev clan to join the Jakira clan because then they'd have more influence in the resulting sept. I see, Mosby thought for a moment. Could the western Shengev join a different sept from the southern Shengev? Jijingi shook his head. We Shengev all have one father, so we should all remain together. All the elders agree on that. But if lineage is so important, how can the elders from the west argue that the Shengev clan ought to join with the Jakira clan? That's what the disagreement was about. The elders from the west are claiming that Shengev was the son of Jakira. Wait, you don't know who Shengev's parents were? Of course we know. Sabe can recite his ancestors all the way back to Tiv himself. The elders from the west are merely pretending that Shengev was Jakira's son because they'd benefit from joining the Jakira clan. But if Shengev clan joined the Kwande clan, wouldn't your elders benefit? Yes, but Shengev was Kwande's son. Then Jijingi realized what Mosby was implying. You think our elders are the ones pretending? No, not at all. It just sounds like both sides are evenly good claims, and there's no way of telling who's right. Sabe is right. Of course, said Mosby, but how can you get the others to admit that? In the land where I come from, many people write down their lineage on paper. That way, we can trace our ancestry precisely, even many generations in the past. Yes, I've seen the lineages of your Bible, tracing Abraham back to Adam. Of course, but even apart from the Bible, people have recorded their lineages. When people want to find out who they're descended from, they can consult paper. If you had paper, the other elders would have to admit that Sabe was right. That was a good plan, Jijingi admitted. If only the Shengev clan had been using paper long ago, then something occurred to him. How long ago did the Europeans come to Tivland? I'm not sure. At least 40 years ago, I think. Do you think they might have written down anything about the Shengev clan's lineage when they first arrived? Mosby looked thoughtful. Perhaps. The administration definitely keeps a lot of records. If there are any, they'd be stored at the government station in Katsina Ala. A truck carried goods along the motor road into Katsina Ala every 5th day, when the market was being held, and the next market would be the day after tomorrow. If he left in the morning, he could reach the motor road in time to get a ride. Do you think that they would let me see them? It might be easier if you have a European with you, said Mosby, smiling. Shall we take a trip? Nicole opened the door to her apartment and invited me in. She was obviously curious about why I'd come. So, what do you want to talk about? I wasn't sure how to begin. This is going to sound strange. Okay, she said. I told her about my viewing partial life log using Remem when she was 16 that ended with me yelling at her and leaving the house. Do you remember that day? Of course I do. She looked uncomfortable, uncertain of where I was going with this. I remembered it too, or at least I thought I did, but I remembered it differently. The way I remembered it, it was you who said that to me. Me who said what? I remember you telling me that I could leave for all you cared, and that you'd be better off without me. Nicole stared at me for a long time. All these years, that's how you've remembered that day? Yes, until today. That'd almost be funny if it weren't so sad. I felt sick to my stomach. I'm sorry. I can't tell you how sorry I am. Sorry that you said it, or sorry that you imagined me saying it? Both. Well, you shouldn't be. You know how that made me feel? I can't imagine. I know I felt terrible when I thought you had said it to me. Except that was just something you made up. It actually happened to me. She shook her head in disbelief. Fucking typical. That hurt to hear. Is it really? Sure, she said. You're always acting like you're the victim, like you're the good guy who deserves to be treated better than you are. You make me sound like I'm delusional. Not delusional, just blind and self-absorbed. I bristled a little. I'm trying to apologize here. Right. This is about you. No, you're right. I'm sorry. I waited until Nicole gestured for me to go on. I guess I am blind and self-absorbed. The reason it's hard for me to admit that is that I thought I had opened my eyes and gotten over that. She frowned. What? I told her how I felt like I had turned around as a father and rebuilt our relationship, culminating in a moment of bonding at her college graduation. Nicole wasn't openly derisive, but her expression caused me to stop talking. It was obvious I was embarrassing myself. Did you still hate me at graduation? I asked. Was I completely making it up that you and I got along then? No, we did get along at graduation, but it wasn't because you had magically become a good father. What was it then? She paused, took a deep breath, and then said, I started seeing a therapist when I went to college. She paused again. She pretty much saved my life. My first thought was, why would Nicole need a therapist? I pushed that down and said, I didn't know you were in therapy. Of course you didn't. You were the last person I would have told. Anyway, by that time I was a senior, and she had convinced me that I was better off not staying angry with you. That's why you and I got along so well at graduation. So I had indeed fabricated a narrative that bore little resemblance to reality. Nicole had done all of the work, and I had done none. I guess I don't really know you. She shrugged. You know me as well as you need to. That hurt, but I could hardly complain. You deserve better, I said. Nicole gave a brief, rueful laugh. You know, when I was younger, I used to daydream about you saying that, but now, well, it's not like it fixes everything, is it? I realized that I'd been hoping that she would forgive me then and there, and that everything would be good, but it would take more than me saying sorry to repair the relationship. Something occurred to me. I can't change things that I did, but I can at least stop pretending that I didn't do them. I'm going to use Remem and get an honest picture of myself. Take a kind of personal inventory. Nicole looked at me, gauging my sincerity. Fine, she said, but let's be clear. You don't come running to me every time you feel guilty over treating me like crap. I've worked hard to put that behind me, and I'm not going to relive it just so you can feel better about yourself. Of course. I saw that she was tearing up, and I've upset you again by bringing all this up. I'm sorry. It's all right, Dad. I appreciate what you're trying to do. Just, let's not do that again for a while, okay? Right. I moved towards the door to leave, but then stopped. I just wanted to ask, if it's possible, if there's anything I can do to make amends? Make amends? She looked incredulous. I don't know. Just be more considerate, will you? And that's what I'm trying to do. At the government station, there was indeed paper from 40 years ago, what the Europeans called assessment reports, and Mosby's presence was sufficient enough to grant them access. They were written in European language, which Jijingi couldn't read, but they included diagrams of the ancestry of various clans, and he could identify the Tiv names in those diagrams easily enough, and Mosby had confirmed that his interpretation was correct. The elders in the western farms were right, and Sabe was wrong. Shangev was not Kwande's son. He was Jakira's. One of the men at the government station had agreed to type up a copy of the relevant page so Jijingi could take it with him. Mosby decided to stay at Katsina Ala to visit the missionaries there, but Jijingi came home right away. He felt like an impatient child on a return trip, wishing he could ride the truck all the way back instead of having to walk from the motor road. As soon as he had arrived at the village, Jijingi looked for Sabe. He found him on the path leading to the neighboring farm. Some neighbors had stopped Sabe to have him settle a dispute over how many nanny goats' kids should be distributed. Finally, they were satisfied, and Sabe resumed his walk. Jijingi walked beside him. "Welcome back," said Sabe. "Sabe, I've been to Katsina Ale." "Ah, why did you go there?" Jijingi showed him the paper. This was written long ago, when Europeans first came here. They spoke to the elders of the Shangev clan then, and when the elders told them the history of the Shangev clan, they said that Shangev were the son of Jakira. Sabe's reaction was mild. "Whom did the Europeans ask?" Jijingi looked at the paper. "Batur and Yorkyaha." "I remember them," he said, nodding. "They were wise men. They would not have said such a thing." Jijingi pointed to the words on the page. "But they did. Perhaps you are reading it wrong." "I am not. I know how to read." Sabe shrugged. "Why would you bring this paper back here?" "What it says is important. It means we should rightfully be joined with the Jakira clan." "You think the clan should trust your decision on this matter?" "I'm not saying the clan should trust me. I'm asking them to trust men who were elders when you were young. And so they should. But those men aren't here. All you have is this paper. This paper tells what they would say if they were here." "Does it?" "A man doesn't speak only one thing. If Bakur and Yorgyala were here, they would agree with me that we should join the Kwande clan." "How could they, when Shangev was the son of Jakira?" He pointed at the sheet of paper. "The Jakira are our closer kin." Sabe stopped walking and turned to face Jijingi. "Questions of kinship cannot be resolved on paper. You're a scribe because Maisho of the Kwande clan warned me about the boys from the mission school. Maisho wouldn't have looked out for us if we didn't share the same father. Your position is proof of how close our clans are. But you forget that. You look to the paper to tell you what you already know here." Sabe tapped on his chest. "Have you studied the paper so much that you have forgotten what it is to be Tiv?" Jijingi opened his mouth to protest when he realized that Sabe was right. All the time he'd spent studying writing had made him think like a European. He had come to trust what was written on paper over what was said by people, and that wasn't the Tiv way. The assessment report of the Europeans was veau. It was exact and precise, but it wasn't enough to settle the question. The choice of which clan to join with had to be right for the community. It had to be Mimi. Only the elders could determine what was Mimi. It was their responsibility to decide what was best for the Shangev clan. Asking Sabe to defer to the paper was asking him to act against what he considered right. "You're right, Sabe," he said. "Forgive me. You're my elder, and it was wrong of me to suggest that the paper could know more than you." Sabe nodded and resumed walking. "You are free to do as you wish. but I believe it will do more harm than good to show this paper to others. Jijingi considered it. The elders from the Western farms would undoubtedly argue that the assessment report supported their position, prolonging the debate that had already gone on too long. But more than that, it would move the Tiv down a path of regarding paper as a source of truth. It would be another stream in which the old ways were washing away, and he could see no benefit in that. I agree, said Jijingi. We won't show this to anyone else. Sabe nodded. Jijingi walked back to his hut, reflecting on what had happened. Even without attending the mission school, he began thinking like a European. This practice of writing in his notebooks had led him to disrespect his elders without him even being aware of it. Writing had helped him think more clearly. He couldn't deny that. But it wasn't good enough reason for him to trust paper over people. As a scribe, he had to keep a book of Sabe's decisions in tribal court, but he didn't need to keep other notebooks, the ones which he had written down his thoughts. He would use them as tinder for the cooking fire. We don't normally think of it as such, but writing is a technology, which means that a literate person is someone whose thought processes are technologically mediated. We became cognitive cyborgs as soon as we became fluent readers, and the consequences of that were profound. Before a culture adopts the use of writing, when its knowledge is transmitted exclusively through oral means, it can very easily revise its history. It's not intentional, but it is inevitable. Throughout the world, bards and griots have adopted their material to their audiences, and thus gradually adjusted the past to suit the needs of the present. The idea that accounts of the past shouldn't change is a product of literate culture's reverence for the written word. Anthropologists will tell you that oral cultures understand the past differently. For them, their histories don't need to be accurate so much as they need to validate the community's understanding of itself. So it wouldn't be correct to say that their histories are unreliable. The histories do what they need to do. Right now, each of us is a private oral culture. We rewrite our pasts to suit our needs and support the story we tell about ourselves. With our memories, we are all guilty of a Whig interpretation of our personal histories, seeing our former selves as steps towards our glorious present selves. But this era is coming to an end. Remem is merely the first of a new generation of memory prosthesis, and these products gain widespread adoption. We will be replacing our malleable organic memories with perfect digital archives. We will have a record of what we actually did instead of a story that evolves over repeated tellings. Within our minds, each of us will be transformed from an oral culture into a literate one. It would be easy for me to assert that literate cultures are better off than oral ones, but my bias should be obvious, since I'm writing these words rather than speaking them to you. Instead, I will say it is easier for me to appreciate the benefits of literacy and harder for me to recognize everything it has cost us. Literacy encourages a culture to place more value on documentation and less on subjective experience. And overall, I think the positives outweigh the negatives. Written records are subject to every kind of error that interpretation is subject to change. But at least the words on the page remain fixed, and there is real merit in that. When it comes to our individual memories, I live on the opposite side of the divide. As someone whose identity was built on organic memory, I'm threatened by the prospect of removing subjectivity from our recall of events. I used to think that it could be valuable for individuals to tell stories about themselves, valuable in a way that it couldn't be for cultures. But I'm a product of my time, and times change. We can't prevent the adoption of digital memory any more than oral cultures can stop the arrival of literacy. So the best I can do is look for something positive in it. And I think I've found the real benefit of digital memory. The point is not to prove that you are right. The point is to admit that you are wrong. Because all of us have been wrong on various occasions, engaged in cruelty and hypocrisy, and we've forgotten most of those occasions. And this means that we don't really know ourselves. How much personal insight can I claim if I can't trust my memory? How much can you? You're probably thinking, while your memory isn't perfect, you've never engaged in revisionism of the magnitude that I'm guilty of. But I was just as certain as you, and I was wrong. You may say, I know I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. I am here to tell you that you have made more than you think, and some of the core assumptions on which your self-image is built are actually lies. Spend some time using Remem, and you'll find out. But the reason I now recommend Remem is not for the shameful reminders it provides of your past. It's to avoid the need for those in the future. Organic memory was what enabled me to construct a whitewashed narrative of my parenting skills. But by using digital memory from now on, I hope to keep that from happening. The truth about my behavior won't be presented to me by someone else, making me defensive. It won't even be something I'll discover as a private shock, prompting a reevaluation. With Remem providing only the unvarnished facts, my image of myself will never stray too far from the truth in the first place. Digital memory will not stop us from telling stories about ourselves. As I said earlier, we are made of stories, and nothing can change that. What digital memory will do is change those stories from fabrications that emphasize our best acts and elide our worsts into ones that, I hope, acknowledge our fallibility and make us less judgmental about the fallibility of others. Nicole has begun using Remem as well and discovered that her recollection of events isn't perfect either. This hasn't made her forgive me for the way I treated her, nor should it, because her misdeeds were a minor compared to mine. But it has softened her anger at my misremembering my actions, because she realized it is something we all do. And I'm embarrassed to admit that this is precisely the scenario Erica Myers predicted when she talked about Remem's effects on relationships. This doesn't mean I've changed my mind about the downsides of digital memory. There are many, and people need to be aware of them. I just don't think I can argue the case with any sort of objectivity anymore. I abandoned the article I was planning to write about the memory prosthesis. I handed off the research I'd done to a colleague, and she wrote a fine piece about the pros and cons of the software, a dispassionate article free of all the soul-searching and angst that would have saturated anything I had submitted. Instead, I've written this. The account I've given of Teve is based in fact, but isn't precisely accurate. There was indeed a dispute among the Teve in 1941 over whom the Shangev clan would join with, based on differing claims about the parentage of the clan's founder, and administrative records that did show the clan's elders' account of their genealogy had changed over time. But many of the specific details I've described were invented. The actual events were more complicated and less dramatic, and the actual events always are. So I have taken liberties to make a better narrative. I've told a story in order to make a case for the truth. I recognize the contradiction here. As for my account with my argument with Nicole, I've tried to make it as accurate as I possibly could. I've been recording everything since I started working on this project, and I've consulted the recordings repeatedly when writing this. But in my choice of which details to include and which to omit, perhaps I have just constructed another story. In spite of my efforts to be unflinching, have I flattered myself with this portrayal? Have I distorted events so they more closely follow the arc expected of a confessional narrative? The only way you can judge is by comparing my account against the recordings themselves. So I'm doing something I never thought I would do. With Nicole's permission, I'm granting public access to my life log, such as it is. Take a look at the video and decide for yourself. And if you think I've been less honest, tell me. I want to know.